Uh, Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce you to today's remarkable event, and thank you all for joining us. I'm Orzala Nemat, Director of Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit. Today's event has three parts. First, we would like to share some of our voices and experiences from the borderland areas in three regions: Afghanistan, Colombia, and Myanmar. Secondly, we are going to hear from our experts who will discuss the tensions, trade-offs, and ways forward to better integrate drugs development and peace building. And finally, we will have about 30 minutes for audience to ask questions. You can write your questions using Q&A box, and at the same time, you have the choice of using your name and your organization's name, or posing or posting your questions anonymously. We will be closely monitoring the Q&A box and will make sure to, within the time frame, to ask you questions from the panelists. We will be also trying our best to work within the framework or the time frame that we have. Drugs and Disorder program is a 4-year research project seeking to address the question of how can war economies be transformed into peace economies, working in 9 drug and conflict-affected borderlands regions of Afghanistan, Colombia, and Myanmar. One of the borderlands regions we are looking at is Nangarhar province, a place which is a hometown for myself. Together, these 3 countries are the world's largest drugs and illicit drugs producers. All have experienced years of violent conflict and are at the midst of somewhat or some form of a peace process. We focus on illicit drugs because they are one of the main commodities fueling the war economy. And we focus on the borderlands because they often become the hubs for transnational drug economies and can remain conflict hotspots even after national peace agreements, as the experiences show. And so we believe that borderlands are central to the challenges of transforming drug-fueled war economies into sustainable peace economies or peacetime economies. This event is launching our flagship publication, Voices from the Borderland. Voices from the Borderlands is a 67-page report. We also have an 8-page policy brief, a digital report, and accompanied by an 8-page comic telling a life story of a man who became involved in drug trade from Nangarhar province in Afghanistan. The Voices from the Borderlands is about foregrounding of life stories and perspectives of people who are actually living in these realities every day. They are voices we have listened to during our field research and field work throughout the countries. These perspectives are currently not sufficiently heard in policy debates and decision-making platforms, but we think there is a lot to learn and listen from these voices. So we will start this event by hearing some of the voices from our borderlands. I'm now going to hand over to Dancing Lawn from Catchland Research Center, Jasmine Batia from SOAS, and Camilo Acero Vargas from the Universidad Nacional de Colombia to present some of these voices from the borderlands. Acero, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Orzala. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Well, in Colombia, we are looking at illicit drug production. Voices from the Borderlands includes testimonies of coca growers and harvesters living in 3 borderland regions, Puerto Asís and Tumaco in the south, and Santa Marta in the north. These testimonies are from our fieldwork, interviews, and also a survey we conducted with coca farmers who have signed up to the substitution program, which was born from the Peace Accord in 2016. The first key message that came from the Colombian borderlands is that many people have made modest socioeconomic progress because of coca, but this comes at a high cost. And there is a trade-off, tough trade-off, and that includes increase of violence. As you can see in the quote in the slide, coca is helping people and communities to develop economically, to earn a living or invest in equipment, improve their home, educate their children also. And a coca grower put it in these terms, and I quote, "I am not ungrateful with coca. It is very important to recognize that this progress has also benefited women. But you can also see in the survey response that when we asked people if coca production had increased violence in the region, overwhelmingly 77% say yes. And this violence is attributable in part to illegal armed groups and in part to the state. So we think that these are tough everyday trade-offs and decisions that farmers have to make. The second message in the Colombian case is that coca growers are farmers and not narcos. Nevertheless, the Colombian state has maintained a consistent policy of exclusion and has imposed prohibitive costs and risk on them, on these coca growers. As can be seen in the quote, the daily activity of the cocalero is not much different from that of any farmer in Colombia. It is common for them to use family labor to grow coca and to hire pickers for the harvest. And in parallel to coca, the farms also produce corn, yuca, and rice. And not only do they live like the average farmer, but they also spend their money like a typical rural middle class. The graph in the slide shows that the consumption patterns of the coca growers have no relation to the lavish spending of a narco. However, the war on drugs in Colombia is a war against the peasant who grow coca. Their livelihoods and health are affected by forced eradication policies and, until very recently, by aerial glyphosate spraying. And finally, and this is our last message that is coming from the borderlands of Colombia, is that cocalero face different exclusions, but they are by no means passive subjects. They seek to organize and have a politically active life. The graph in the slide shows that growers do not have access to essential public services such as water or sewerage, and they also lack access to productive resources such as credit, irrigation, and roads. And if we add to this the violence of which they are victims, it is clear that cocaleros suffer appalling forms of exclusion. But exclusion has not translated into passivity, and this is a point that we really want to emphasize. On the contrary, as the quote shows, the coca growers in Colombia have organized themselves to be self-providing. They use community work to build local infrastructure such as roads, schools, and bridges. And the strong social agency of the coca growers is also reflected in their mobilization campaigns. So for decades, they have protested against forced eradications and claimed viable economic alternatives. And one success of the peace agreement we consider was to allow coca growers to participate in public affairs. However, their voice still does not have the importance it deserves in decisions on drug policy. This is our three key messages that are coming from the Colombian borderlands. Thank you. Jasmine, I think it's your turn.
Yes, so thank you very much. So I am going to turn briefly to some of our key findings that are emerging from Afghanistan. So in Afghanistan, the Voices from the Borderlands includes testimonies of opium and heroin traders and transporters living in two borderland regions, Nangarhar in the east and Nimroz in the southwest. So turning to our first key message, is that trading systems in Afghanistan's borderlands are influenced by three key factors: trust, brokerage, and violence. In the absence of strong regulatory frameworks, trading networks rely on interpersonal relationships and trust to move goods across borders. There are many different kinds of people working as brokers to help this flow of goods. They're mediating between, for example, government and opposition forces, or potentially with cross-border officials. They impose informal taxes at various choke points in exchange for facilitating trade. However, small-scale traders and transporters are often vulnerable to exploitation and violence at the hands of both government and opposition forces. Contrary to perceptions that illicit drug trades are exceptionally violent, the Voices from the Borderlands from Afghanistan shows that all trading networks, both licit and illicit, operate in the shadow of violence, coercion, and threats. Frequently, only the most powerful actors have the resources and connections to overcome these constraints, placing them in an economic advantage vis-a-vis their competitors, which is illustrated by the quote on the slide. So turning to our next key message, this concerns the boom of frontier towns such as Zaran City in Nimruz. These towns have boomed due to growing cross-border licit and illicit trade flows. These flows have been accompanied by more investments in infrastructure, such as roads, housing, and public services. However, what we've found is that these investments sometimes come at a cost. Our respondents described how inequality has grown in Zaran City, with the most lucrative land and business opportunities increasingly monopolized by warlords and other elites with high-level government connections. As trade flows have grown, border controls have tightened considerably, disrupting informal flows of goods and people that many settlements along the border are economically dependent on. Over the past decade, Iran has constructed a border wall along the Iranian-Afghan border, which has severed links between many economically and culturally interdependent communities. This has had a disproportionate effect on the livelihoods of young people in Nimruz, leading many of them to turn to illicit smuggling of drugs and people to survive. And again, this is illustrated by the quote on the slide, which is taken from a life history of an ex-militia commander from Zaran City. And so finally, just turning to our third key message, which is that indeed, again and again, our findings demonstrated how important illicit trade is in securing the livelihoods of families living in extremely violent and risky environments. In contrast to commonly held stereotypes of rich narco-traffickers, the vast majority of participants in illicit drug economies are small-scale actors with few other options. Illicit drugs have provided a particularly important lifeline during periods of severe conflict. During the Afghan Civil War in the 1990s, transporting illicit drugs across borders provided vital incomes for poor farmers living in dire circumstances. One of the most interesting people we spoke to from Nangarhar told us how he once transported heroin from Afghanistan all the way to Moscow in the 1990s, dodging the authorities and overcoming numerous obstacles along the way. His experience have been captured in a comic book we produced as part of this project, which is being released today in English and is soon to be available in Dari and Pashto. And you can see on the slide here the cover of the comic book, as well as a short quote from the comic book as well. So that's all for Afghanistan, and now I'll turn to Dan Sang to introduce some of the key messages from Myanmar.
Thank you, Jasmine, and thank you, Ozala. And I think in our part, for our part in Myanmar, Voices from the Borderlands includes testimonies from people living in communities affected by rising levels of drug use. We look at two major borderland regions. One is Kachin State and the other one is Shan State. Kachin State is bordering with China and India, and Shan State is bordering with China and Thailand. So we have three key messages to present today. And the first, turning to the first message, I think our research reveals how rising levels of drug harm has been a defining feature of how people have experienced ceasefires and economic development in Kachin State and Shan State. For instance, I think ceasefires in the 1980s and 1990s opened up borderland areas for extensive resource extraction. Drug use subsequently became widespread in mining and logging areas, as this quote shows. Also, in many areas, army-backed militias have been deployed as counterinsurgency forces to police local populations. and secure sites for economic development. In return, these militias gain unofficial permission to become involved in the drug trade. Drugs therefore became embedded in formal governance systems in the borderlands. Our research also offers more locally grounded insights into the kinds of peace and development that are actually materializing in Myanmar's borderlands, and how drugs have become entangled in people's everyday lives. It also demonstrates how these ceasefire experiences shape civil society discussions about the current peace process and about potential solutions to the harms caused by drugs. Turning to the second key message, uh, the Voices from the Borderland also highlights the complex relationship between drugs and poverty across Kachin State and Chan State. Opium production is essential to the livelihoods of many poor households, but changing patterns of drug use are creating new forms of vulnerability and poverty. Cultivating poppy provides income for many of the region's poorest households. It also generates cash to pay for food, education, and to treat various ailments. However, the rise in use of heroin and methamphetamines has had a devastating impact for many families already struggling with poverty, and in ways that often have gendered dimensions, as this code clearly shows. Despite this, development and peace building agencies have often been reluctant to engage with sensitive drug issues. There is also often a fundamental disconnect between agencies working on against drugs and those working on development and peace building. Nevertheless, separating out these issues makes no sense for local communities where the challenges of violence, drug, chronic poverty, and community development and welfare are deeply interconnected. I think we cannot really compartmentalize them. They are all interconnected. Therefore, our research shows that efforts aimed at alleviating poverty and livelihood insecurity need to pay greater attention to both the importance of drug cultivation and the negative impact of drug use. I think our last key message highlights the fact that young people have become particularly vulnerable to drug-related harms in Myanmar's borderland, and this will have a damaging impact on society for years to come. This is partly linked to the fact that schools and universities have become common sites for drug use. Being able to travel for study became increasingly common since the ceasefires, as declining levels of armed conflict allowed people to travel. As a result, more young people were able to access education, but also experience greater exposure to illicit drugs, another kind of vulnerability. Rising drug use amongst young people is also attributed to the lack of opportunities for young people, as clearly alluded in this code. There is often a big gap between young people's hopes and aspirations and the life chances they actually have. Therefore, our research also draws attention to the ease with which young people can access drugs compared to the difficulty of accessing support for drug use, especially from the rural, especially for the rural populations. And so worsening drug harms, especially amongst young people, must be understood against a backdrop of ongoing systematic marginalization of ethnic minority populations, a lack of broad-based development and welfare opportunities, but the last but not the least, the huge limitations in social service provisions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Camilo, Jasmine, and Dancing for excellent presentation and a very short summary of 2 years experiences of highlighting the findings from the research. I'm now pleased to move to the second part of our program, which is a panel discussion. I'd like to introduce the distinguished panelists and some of the questions that we will cover during this part of the program. We are very grateful to have Anne Fordham, who is Executive Director of International Drugs Policy Consortium. Anne is also chair of the Strategic Advisory Group to the United Nations on Drugs Use and HIV. Anne has been working on drugs issues for many years, leading international civil society advocacy efforts to humanize the drugs issues and to reform drug law and policy. So today she's going to bring us drugs policy perspective to our discussion. We are also pleased to have David Keane with us. David Keane is a professor of conflict studies at the London School of Economics. He is an author of a number of seminal books on war economies and conflicts, including the economic functions of violence in civil wars and the best of enemies, conflict and collusion in Sierra Leone. In recent article, Double Games on the War on Drugs, Terror and Migration, he's raising a question: why, if these policies are not achieving their stated goals, do they continue? And what sort of interests are bounded up in the making of these policies? An important question that our project is also trying to and seeking to engage with. Finally, last but not least, we are pleased to have Estefania Ciro Rodriguez with us. Estefania is a professor at the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies on Development at the University of Los Angeles in Colombia. She was named laureate of the UNESCO Prize for Promotion of Social Science Research in Latin America and the Caribbean. And her research on the role of coca leaf cultivation in Amazonian rainforest communities of Colombia. Estefania has done an extensive field research and field work into the lives of the men and women who grow coca, the violence and that they face, and finally, the place coca culture in their tradition and livelihoods. So she's going to bring very grounded perspective to this debate that we have today. In the panel discussion, we are going to pose mainly 3 questions to our distinguished panelists, and then we open the floor for their opening remarks and continuing the conversation. So the first question is about rethinking the relationship between drugs development and violence in war to peace transitions. From your perspectives, what are some of the main barriers to reconcile these 3 areas in war to peace transitions? And what do you see as the entry points for rethinking these relationships between these different entities or areas? The second question is on tough trade-offs. What are the trade-offs? What do you think are the biggest trade-offs that have to be faced to better sort of integrate drugs development and peace-building policies? Or is there a way of sort of integrating them? And finally, the third question is on how can we better incorporate the voices and perspectives of those involved in illicit economies into the policy debates, the very attempt that we are doing through publishing the Voices from the Borderlands. So I'll start by asking each panelist to share some of the initial thoughts and reflections and on these questions, and then turn and provide later an opportunity briefly to respond on each other's points before we move to the final part of this program, which is a Q&A by questions from the audience. Thank you, and the floor is open. And
Thank
we may
you.
start with you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ozala, for the introduction, and also thank you to SOAS and to Jonathan Goodhand for inviting me to be on the panel today. And I very much welcome this discussion and also the report, the Voices from the Borderlands report, especially the attention that you have paid to the perspectives of the communities who are living in these situations. And it's so important that we hear those perspectives and bring them into the discussion, and also the narrative of how actually the drugs drugs economy, in a way, also has very many positive benefits for these communities. So let me turn to try and just give my initial thoughts on the questions that you posed, Ozala. I think, on the first point of rethinking the relationship between drugs development and peace building, I really think that one of the key sort of policy impasses in that discussion is the continued failure and inability of governments to openly acknowledge that decades of effort, billions of dollars, has been spent on trying to eradicate the global illicit market, and that effort has failed. Every year, the UN Office of Drugs and Crime produces their World Drug Report. It was only released 1 month ago, the latest one, and every year we see that the market is, robust, diverse, and increasingly diversified. And I think, that has to be acknowledged. And I think the issue then is that policy incoherence that is driven by the different objectives of drug control, development, and peace building is incredibly problematic. It is not a policy neutral discussion. Drug policies, repression drives a huge amount of harm and undermines these other goals of pro-poor policies, pro-poor development, state building, and peace building. And I think we have to really start to acknowledge that within the development and peace building discussions as well, rather than seeing drug control as separate to those efforts. Not only are they not separate, they often directly undermine those efforts. And that's why the discussion that we've had so far, and hearing from the perspectives on the ground about the role of illicit economies being so important for livelihoods in these conflict areas, but also in many other rural and indeed urban settings where opportunities are limited, frankly. That conversation needs to be brought also into the drug policy discussions, because still in so much of the drug policy debate amongst governments, and I work particularly at the UN level, the classic narrative that still prevails to this day is that drug economies are fundamentally bad, that they undermine development, they undermine peace and security, and therefore justify harsh law enforcement measures that have such a detrimental impact on these communities. So I think that's important. And then linking that to the tough trade-offs question, I think just obviously to acknowledge that there are so many trade-offs that have to happen at the community and individual level, and the example there of Colombia in particular, that people are having to engage in coca production but then experience higher levels of violence. I think it's important to question how much of that violence is driven by drug control policies and the state as well. And if you remove that, would they experience some less violence? Of course, we know there's also non-state violence. And in terms of the bigger policy trade-offs discussion, I think, I refer back to my first point. I think we have to deprioritize this zero tolerance idea of drug-free societies and move towards ways of managing the drug market and prioritize health, human rights, peace, and development. And finally, in terms of the involvement of the most affected, again, so important, so critical in these discussions. But I think all people who've been involved in the illicit market, whether it's in production, trafficking, consumption, have been so stigmatized and marginalized and demonized by the dominant drug policy narrative that this needs to be challenged also in terms of bringing these people into the discussion. Their criminalization is a huge barrier to their participation in the policy discussions that directly affect them. They need support, as we've heard, also to be able to organize, to claim their rights. And of course, many of them, as we know in the situation of Colombia, where farmers, social leaders of farmers groups have been, unlawfully killed, assassinated. It is that violence that they experience, so directly and so extremely, is incredibly problematic for their participation. And there are good examples of farmers being able to organize. There's the example from Myanmar of the Myanmar Opium Farmers Forum. They have organized, claimed their place at the table and are starting to engage in policy discussions. Thank you. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. I think what I have to say sort of fits rather neatly, I think, with what Anne was just saying. I just wanted to briefly say that, you know, in my own work, I've tried to sort of look at war as a system, look at the idea that the aim is not only to win, but there are a number of other aims which often take precedence and may be actually impeded by an end to the war. Economic aims, political repression, repression of human rights workers and so on, we've seen under the cover of a war on drugs. Psychological aims, I think it's interesting, especially in view of what Anne was saying, this kind of criminalization of large groups of people. If you stigmatize people, it affects their behavior in the medium term and the long term. So this is sort of the Shylock idea, since I calls me dog before I am a dog, beware my fangs. You know, I think it's very relevant in a lot of contexts, including this one. If we think about war to peace transitions, I think a key thing to recognize is that a lot of the benefits that are growing up during a war are actually going to extend over into peacetime. And various parties can be expected to use violence and the threat of violence in peacetime, and it's difficult to define peacetime, for many of the same purposes that they used in war. So we don't tend to see a sharp transition from war to peace, but a kind of a reinvention or a remodeling of exploitation. And I think in terms of trade-offs, you know, from a very practical point of view, sometimes peace may be impossible without actually a degree of entrenching and rewarding corruption, exploitation. If you try to stamp out corruption completely, if you try to stamp out drugs trading, if you try to end impunity, prosecute all the people who've done bad things, sometimes actually peace proves to be, I think, quite impossible. So there are trade-offs there in terms of what is going to be tolerated. And of course, the opposite applies as well, that if you reward a lot of people who've done terrible things and you entrench impunity, that sends a very dangerous signal about violence. So these are some of the trade-offs. I think often there's a kind of outright war against rebels or terrorists is replaced by a kind of war on crime or a war on drugs. We saw this in Guatemala, for example, where I did some relatively brief research. So I'm very interested in, I wrote this this article with Ruben Anderson, Double Games in Political Geography. And what we were trying to do was to sort of map out the perverse incentives that have grown up around the war on terror, the war on drugs, the so-called fight against illegal migration. And to explore the idea in a way that when something is labeled as the ultimate evil, like drugs or terrorists or a certain group of rebels, or the intra-Hamwe, or perhaps migration, the human smugglers, and so on, there tends to be a sort of a coalition of actors that coalesce around the ostensible and the proclaimed aim of combating that evil. But those actors have a very diverse set of agendas, as we will all be aware, and a lot of the time it has to do with exploitation, has to do with political repression, it has to do with the impunity for various kinds of abuses that you can actually secure in the context of a global and or a national war against this or that. So there are people signing up to these wars with a variety of purposes in mind, and something that I've tended to find quite often is there's a high degree of collusion very often between people, a wide variety of actors, and the very phenomenon that they are claiming to suppress. And one of the reasons for this is that in a sense, their legitimacy and their funding and their international status often comes precisely from positioning themselves as somebody who will combat the threat which they are publicly highlighting and which they claim to be combating. But actually it's a threat sometimes that they need. So that's this sort of idea that people have useful enemies, And this is part of the difficulty of ending war. One of the reasons why war tends to sort of mutate from one form of war to another. It makes it very difficult to sort of rein in. In terms of the, another thing we were trying to do in the Double Games article is to show how risks and costs in these various different wars, or so-called wars, tend to get distributed and focused on particular geographical areas, particular marginalized groups who don't have much say within the political decision-making process. I think that's part of the importance of the project that you're doing, that it's bringing some of those marginalized voices more to the fore, and it's part of a sort of an ongoing attempt to address that inequality in political power. So in a sense, when a system is failing, and it might be the war on terror or the war on drugs or a number of other systems, I think it's very important to look at how the benefits and costs of that system are being distributed. And actually, a lot of people are succeeding, both in terms of the distribution of benefits and the distribution of costs within these various systems, which are ostensibly, which appear to be failing. And that's, I think, an important part of what we are trying to examine. And that's how I would sort of frame it in a way.
Thank you. Stefania?
Okay, thank you so much. I celebrate the launch of this document, and I highly recommend reading to all those interested in addressing a complex but exciting topics: drugs, development, violence, and peace building. We are talking about borderlands, but also border, voices, corps, and actors. I think this document gets understand local and global debates, and that's not easy for foreign and local researchers to analyze this with your rigor. And I appreciate this, especially when you are comparing three countries. This is a very interesting example of alliance between institutions, researchers, and countries. This makes the proposal, the questions, and the content very fascinating. So I want to emphasize three ideas about the questions. I agree, we have to take distance of hegemonic discourses or traditional repressive narratives to understand drugs and to understand the relation drugs with violence and economies. No, we have to destroy myths, the fables of the war on drugs. The first thing that we have to remark, big quotations, remarks on war on drugs. War on drugs could be more lethal than illicit markets. Not forget also the interventionist or geopolitical interventionist character of American drug policy in our countries, for example, in Colombia. I think that's a very important factor. Also, we have to go beyond plain ideas of poverty index, and I agree with the document, the necessity, the need to analyze exclusion, social exclusion, political exclusion, cultural exclusion. That's, I think that's a very important recommendation, and we have to think about intangibles, variables to analyze this phenomenon. Also, we have to move on from peace building to a state building. We need to change the practices of the state power. We have to change the relationship between farmers and the state. And also we have to analyze the way that the state get how to say this, legitimacy, no? I think the war on drugs has affect the legitimacy of the state on these rural borderlands. Also, we have to go beyond the simple dichotomies, good and bad boys, illicit and licit economies, or the central peripheral analysis. And I highly agree with the document about to think this is not a problem of peripheries, but integration, power relations. For example, in the Amazon, we have to think about extractivism, long history of extractivism, and we have to think about losers and winners. I think it's very important. About the big trade-offs, you know, the drug markets are part of capitalism. There are asymmetric spaces of reproduction of winners and losers. And yesterday, the UNODC said that in two little towns in Colombia, Algeria and Tambo, the market, the coca leaves market represent, the cocaine market represent $82 million, no, in two little towns. Also, they explained that drug market in Colombia is producing $371 million coca leaves and $1,900 million cocaine market. So the difference is the private profits. We are talking about private profits. We have to ask what we are going to do with these profits. No, we should, as a society, to decide has private profits regulated by armed and political illegal groups, or to think public or mixed mechanism to regulate this money. Because where is this money? No, you know, corruption and all these things. And also, we have to think about to go beyond the small-scale development programs to structural development. And that's the experience of the substitution crop programs in Colombia. And that's why I insist also in introduce here the rural and peasant studies. Rural and peasant studies has a lot of ideas to share with this agenda of drugs and farmers. So I want to introduce also this element. And finally, I want to say that about the voices and perspectives, I want to say that when I did my PhD dissertation during 4 years ago, I was a witness of this guilt naturalization, guilt sense, the way that drug wars narratives have impacted the way the people, the farmers, the growers, coca growers, understand their roles. But also I was a witness of the creations of farmers organizations that call themselves cocaleros y cocaleras after Plan Colombia. 20 years later, that one of the most important coca growers mobilizations, Marchas Cocaleras, and the cruel and repressive state's actions. It was the first time that they in public said, soy cocalero. I appreciate this emphasis in this document on impacts of stigmatization and repression. There are unequal rules to access to funds, to political recognition. We need to reinforce actor voices from themselves, their autonomy and their organization strength. And finally, we should consider the violent reconfiguration of markets in this post-acuerdo, post-agreement period. We must not forget that we will do fieldwork again in violent areas. The times of the peace agreement are gone. So 2 days ago, 2 massacres in Cordoba, in Colombia, and one of the coca growers areas. So it's time to forge alliances with local actors, because before it's not possible to build trust. So I welcome your proposal. I appreciate this document, and this is a very important bit. I congratulate Brox and the Sorten team.
Thank you very much, Estefania. Thank you very much, David and Anna. I think you had all excellent opening remarks in terms of, the discussion and conversation that we have. As we all know, the 3 countries that are partner in this particular mission or in this particular project are also coming, contextually speaking, through different phases of war to peace transitions, if we can say. For example, in the case of Afghanistan, Afghanistan is already in a very deep conflict and somewhat going through something called peace process. In the case of Colombia, we've already had an agreement and it's the implementation phase. Myanmar is having its own characteristics. So before we have already, just a reminder to our respected audience, if you have any questions, there is a box Q&A. Please post your questions there and we will try our best to take them. We have some time left for our final part of the discussion here. But before going to the audience questions, I would like to give an opportunity to all our respected panelists in case they want to come and have some comments regarding the presentations of other panelists.
Thanks, Ozala, and thanks to David and Estefania for your very insightful comments. I mean, I think, David, I really appreciate your perspective, in general about how narratives in war are often, used, well, sometimes not such a hidden agenda, but basically used to demonize and stigmatize others. And, that link between, how waging war on terror groups often is then relaunched as a war on drugs or a war on crime. And we see that the world over. And in fact, just to go back to the term war on drugs itself, which, is always apparently accredited to Richard Nixon as having coined when he launched this in the US. But, increasingly it's clear, and we've known for a long time, that really wasn't about drugs, right? It was about the Nixon administration, basically wanting to wage war on people of color and also wanting to wage war on, the anti-war protests. And there was a strong link there between linking those groups with drugs in order to repress, demonize them, stigmatize them, and justify, state violence, essentially, if we want to think of it in that way, against those groups. And I think that's a really important part of this conversation that we must have, linking also to Estefania's point about, busting the myths and the homogeny of this war on drugs narrative and what it means for real people and their lives on the ground. And I think relevant to this broader conversation of how it undermines these very other important objectives of development and peace building.
David? David, do you have any?
Yeah, I'm back, I think, now. Yeah, sorry. Just to say briefly, I've really appreciated what Estefania and Anne were saying really about stigmatization. I think it's sort of emerging as a big theme and one that's counted in the report. I do think it's interesting and important to go back to what Anne was saying just now in terms of the origins of the so-called war on drugs and how that related to United States politics. We often think that, you know, international policy and especially United States policy has come out of this sort of attempt to put the problems of the rest of the world to rights. But, you know, I'm very struck recently, the sort of extent of United States police collusion, really, and economic dependence on asset seizure from the so-called war on drugs. And a hugely profitable and corrupt system that has grown up around mass incarceration, around asset seizure and so on. Threats of violence by the authorities being an integral part of that. So I think it's interesting to see how that system, you know, we're not just talking about Afghanistan or Colombia or some places that maybe have a reputation for being quite violent. It goes to the very heart of the international system, some of the main originators of the war on drugs. And the economics of it, the use of violence and intimidation, the racial politics of it. You know, we're talking about stigmatization of people who have already been stigmatized for a number of historical reasons, which obviously vary between country and country. But I do think that the United States is very much at the heart of it in ways that we don't always appreciate.
Thank you, David. Estefania, did you want to come back?
Yes, I just want to say that, for example, in Colombia, the last year, the government launched war against deforestation in the same areas that were intervened by Plan Colombia. So they are constantly, they are launching a war and another war and another war, but at the end is against the same actor, against farmers. No? So there are structural interests to get land, to get to how do you say this, to provoke dispossession on farmers in Colombia. So you can talk about a specific group of people that have been stigmatized and by anti-guerrilla war, anti-narcotics war, and now anti-deforestation war, that is farmers. So I just want to say that.
Thank you all for your remarks. We are now moving to picking up some questions from our audience. The first question coming from Mateus Zuk. He's saying, whenever I read reports from Myanmar or Afghanistan, medical expenses make about 30% of expenditure of opium growing farmers. Researchers like Payne and Mansfield show that subsistence is a huge factor, but should we ask more about the needs for driving farmers to focus on opium production? Could supply of healthcare services be a way to radically undermine the opium cultivation and bring a positive effect to the affected communities? He's also asking a question that at least I know that my organization and the mentioned authors have done a lot of work on. Is alternative livelihoods is a good approach? So let's start with this first question and hear from our panelists on what they have to say with regards to this particular and critical question. Anyone?
Sorry.
Oh, maybe Dan saying you should go first, and then I can also jump in.
Sorry. I think, yeah, I think in my opinion, I think is, the one single approach will not solve the problem. I think definitely, I think there is this the problems of livelihood, the problems of social provisions, and we also need to take into consideration the violent, history and the conflict, the ongoing conflict aspect of the area. I think because in Myanmar's case, I think the opium cultivation is mainly done in the areas which is quite remote, and then there is the conflict going on. I think because in that context, I think the opium is the best commodity which the communities can rely on, and they can turn it into cash very easily, unlike the other crops. I think yes, that would be my initial response to the question.
Yeah, can I add a little bit? Or Anne, did you want to go first? Okay, so I mean, just to add to what Dansang said, which I agree with, I think it's right to point out that in terms of the motivations for opium cultivation, there is a medical aspect to that. So there is a lot of customary use of opium as a substitute for example, pain medication, access to primary health care in many communities where that's not available. However, our research shows that, again, I'm following on what Dansang said, that it's not necessarily going to make a huge impact. It will impact maybe for some communities in a minor way. But what's evident is that people are cultivating not just for medical substitute, but for livelihoods, to supplement their livelihoods overall, so to improve their economic situation. So there are a lot of benefits economically to cultivation that other types of crops don't necessarily deliver. And so it's kind of a partial yes, that it might mitigate opium cultivation to some extent, having access to primary health care, but it's not necessarily going to make a radically significant difference. I think, Rosella, your mic is off.
Sorry. Thank you, Jasmine and Dancing. Just to make sure that's the question, you can also ask questions from our speakers. Thank you both, Dancing and Jasmine, for answering. If there is no further addition to the question, we can move to the second question, which is anonymously asked, and that is like this. In most of the cases, we see very considerable involvement of some of the government authorities in the drugs trade, which then continues at the international level. My question is that has there been any research on this part? How can we address this issue? If anyone from the panelists or speakers wanted to add on that part.
I think in the Myanmar context, I think that is a very sensitive issue to conduct research. And I think there is no particular research, specifically looking at the authorities' involvement in the illicit drug trade. I think that's quite rare, actually. This kind of research, and it's really extremely difficult to conduct as well. But you have the research reports and papers and books which look at the militias, militias and the border guard force issues, and how it's related to the illicit drug trades and the other extractive industries, and this kind of research. I think you'll find it. I think, but not specifically looking at the authorities' involvement in the drug trade. I think that's that's one challenging, areas for the researchers conducting research in Myanmar.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that from the Afghanistan perspective, there is, of course, a lot of anecdotal evidence that's been collected. A lot of this comes from journalistic sources, or it comes from, a lot of interviews that have been conducted, where respondents do name either, generally government officials or specific people in the government that are very much involved in the drug trade. And we see, so there's a lot of evidence that's out there. But as Dansang has said, this is a very difficult and sensitive topic to research directly because we rely as researchers on cooperation and permission of government authorities in order to access areas, in order to conduct research. And so this has always been a little bit of a balancing act for, I think, our team, but also, many other researchers that are conducting research on this topic. But I do think we do touch on this in Voices from the Borderlands when we talk about brokers and people who are, for example, mediating between opposition forces and government forces to allow for the flow of licit and illicit goods, for example, or cross-border contacts between brokers. And so that's one of the ways, the governments are able to participate in the drug trade through these intermediaries. So we are collecting kind of a body of evidence that addresses this point. And I think that's becoming very apparent over time. But again, it's always been a little bit of a balancing act, and it is sensitive because we also do have to think about the well-being of the researchers, people who are conducting research, particularly people who are conducting research over a long period of time, who have very long-standing relationships in particular areas. And so we as researchers have a responsibility to make sure that the safety and security of the field workers is protected at all times.
Just to add a few comments in the Colombian case, of course, it's a dangerous and a sensitive issue for us also, but we think that we can address this issue not directly. I mean, not to try to address directly the involvement of Colombian government in drug business, but to address the way in which state agencies participate and make decisions on drug policies. And I think that this is a huge area in which we still will have to conduct a lot of research in this area, because the way in which the decisions are made is still unknown for most of us. So this is a way in which we can try to address the participation and the involvement, but in the drug policies arena.
Oops, sorry, I was mute again. If no further points, we can move to the following questions. There is one question similar to one related to the earlier one, but I just will combine it with the third and fourth questions. So Beba is asking, what are the challenges of crop substitution strategies for local farmers in the regional context? If one or more of you could cover that question. And there's also a question from Muhammad Salman Khan, doing field work in borderland characterized by conflict and violence raises methodological questions. So if you can explain some key features of research design, especially in relation to 1, recruiting participants and observing their local experiences, and 2, various ethical issues in terms of harm both to the researcher and the research participants. I think this second question is mostly directed to our research team, so feel free, any one of you who can come, but also from our panelists, we can discuss more about the crop substitution strategies and any experiences you could share with us.
Yes, I'll go fast again. I think sorry, I keep talking again and again.
No worries.
So the major challenge of crop substitution in Myanmar's context is the problem of market creation. I think that's the major problem, and then the product creation, I think, is that's the major challenge. And but in the recent years, I think you'll find the Chinese government is pumping a lot of state fund into these borderland regions, under the name of crop substitutions. I think you see these banana plantations, I think in a vast areas. I think some figures suggest that there are more than 200,000 acres of lands under the mono, banana plantation, I think. But it has its negative consequences as well. You have the problem of land grabbing and farmers losing their land and things like that. So that's why I think the crop substitution program itself is not a neutral one as well. So we need to keep in mind, when thinking about whether this the crop substitution would solve the problem of drug productions, opium productions or not. I think that's my points. Yes.
Yeah, and if I can add as well, just from the Afghanistan context, so crop substitution and various alternative development programs have been implemented in Afghanistan many times, and a lot of resources have been put into this. I think one of the challenges of these programs is often, it's seen as a kind of an easy swap. So for example, you'll have a program that will come in and hand out seeds for wheat or for saffron or for something that people see as, okay, well, if we help farmers and train them in how to grow these alternative crops, that will solve the problem. We're giving people an alternative. And it's a very kind of simplistic way of approaching the problem. Not necessarily that it's wrong or that there's no value to it at all, but it doesn't take into account the wider context. And so it doesn't, for example, take into account whether or not farmers have the right infrastructure, they have the right storage, they have the right access to getting goods from point A to point B. So to give one specific example that's often raised is that there's a lot of observations about how there's a lot of poppy growing in Taliban-controlled areas. So one of the things that happens in those areas or in contested areas is that it's a lot easier for farmers sometimes to get opium to the market, because they don't actually have to travel to the market, because the Taliban will come and pick up, or an interlocutor will come and pick up the crops directly from them, or pick up the opium directly from them. And so when you're working in a very insecure, or you're living in a very insecure environment, that can be very attractive for a lot of people, because it's not just necessarily looking at the value of one good versus another good, but also how it fits into the wider context of how people live and how people are trying to work that into their survival strategies and their livelihood strategies. And so taking in the wider context of how people are living, I think is one thing that's been missing from a lot of alternative development programs that we've observed.
I'd just like to add a few comments about the substitution program strategies in Colombia. Well, we have this new big substitution program that it was part of the peace agreement in 2016. Right now we have been during 3 years, the government has been implemented this program, and we have seen we can see some good results in one hand, but on the other hand we have, as Stefania mentioned, the criminalization, assassination of leaders that are in charge of this program. Also, a lack of commitment in the part of Colombian state, because it has not fulfilled its promises. So the main challenges that we have found in our research in Colombia is that first, it repeats again and again the history of the combination of eradication strategies and substitution program. So the peasants, the farmers have on the one hand, the carrot, that is the substitution program, and the other hand, they had the stick, that is the threat of the eradication. That this combination has created a lot of problems for people in the Coca regions. And on the other side, we have that is a combination, as Stefania mentioned before, of small development projects in the context of huge deficits in regards to public services. So they are giving people $1,000 in order to change their way of lives, but they are not offering them new infrastructure, new market access. So this is a great problem. And also regarding security issues, the peace agreement, and in particular this program, has offered the peasant, the coca growers, some participation in the decision making of the program and the implementation, but government has not offered them any security measures. They have, and in fact, it has not changed the relationship between the state and the coca growers. The state is continually seeing the peasant grower, the coca growers, as criminals, as a threat to the country. So it's very difficult to change this narrative and to change the discourse in order for these peasants to involve in other illicit activities.
I just want to add that Camilo said the key points, and I just want to add about this small project focus, this huge international budget and public budget to crop substitutions is used for administrative expenses. So not for real interventions, rural infrastructures that reduce exclusion. It's a business at the end, it's corruption. There is a lot of corruption in this kind of projects. So the farmer doesn't receive the benefits. That's one thing that I want to insist. And also, this anti-peasant, anti-farmers policy attacked food sovereignty and political sovereignty. So we have to reinforce the farmers' organizations and authorities. For example, in Colombia, the farmers in these regions used to be organized around juntas de acción comunal, the HACs, and that's the main authority in their territories, in their lands. But the state is not reinforced that spaces. They are attacking that authorities that they are attacking that spaces of decision, of local decision. So that's a problem. That's all.
Thank you very much, Estefania and Camilo and the rest. So now we move to the following questions. We have a question from Mr. Freudenscharek, directed to Estefania. So since the recent US-Taliban agreement does not include the issue of drugs in poppy cultivation, in the case of Afghanistan, obviously, what are a couple of lessons from Colombia that Afghanistan and the government could learn for its upcoming inter-Afghan dialogue or peace talks? We're basically looking for, lessons that could be learned in terms of, pre-agreement, how to include the issues such as the drugs, illicit economy issues into the agreement. So we can start with Stefania, and then we can go probably for others. Also, David, if you would like to come after.
Yes. First of all, you have to deactivate war on drugs, because the war on drugs it's rhetorical. So if the criminalization persists, they're going to use that anytime they want to reactivate war. So it's not possible to have peace if you don't solve that. For example, in Colombia, we have 6 points in the peace agreement. The 4th point is about drugs. And one of the key points of this chapter was to tratamiento penal diferenciado, the criminalization. But during Juan Manuel Santos, they didn't change the law. So they are still repressing, and they are the military are still attacking people because of this, and they are now thinking about aerial aspersion, and they are still thinking about eradication, and that's the way they again reactive. How do you say that? They again reactive. I don't know how to say that. The war. No, they again insist in war, and that's the problem. So if you don't decriminalize, the key point is the decriminalization, because they are going to use that for intervention, geopolitical intervention, and that's a key point in the peace agreement now, in the crisis now.
Thank you. David, did you want to add something on this one? And then we can move to next questions. David, maybe you're... Okay.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was going to come in on the next one, if that's okay, about the good drug policy.
Yes, actually, the next question is also, just to read the question, it's, is there an example of good drug policy to balance with development and poor, for the poor in avoiding the drug abuse? So please go ahead.
Okay, well, what I was going to say about that, I don't think it's exactly good drug policy, but I do think the work of Van der Veldt-Brown is really interesting on some of the advantages, in a way, of a relatively pragmatic approach to the drugs business that has grown up. She's looking at Myanmar in particular, and obviously there are huge problems and huge suffering, which, you know, Dan will know so much about, and so on. But in terms of a kind of a relatively pragmatic approach, where profits from drugs have sometimes played a part in local peace agreements, buying off warlords, providing a kind of a golden parachute to some extent for the military, creating perhaps a degree of acceptance for some degree of democratization. These are interesting trade-offs. They're very queasy, they're not attractive. I wouldn't want to call it a drug policy success. But actually the way that things grow up organically is sometimes a bit, it's very different from the image that the international community often portrays, where all good things go together. And actually people are pragmatic, and various kinds of violent peace do emerge in different areas. And sometimes the drugs policy, corrupt as it is actually part of that.
Can I also come in here, Ozala?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, just to echo David's point, and I think, you know, absolutely the work of Vanda and others, again, in this space of how to, you know, how we manage drug markets, and how, you know, if what is the primary objective? If the primary objective is, say, violence reduction, then that may lead to a tolerance for a market that is largely peaceful, and then basically interventions when the market becomes violent to show that that is, you know, not acceptable. So those I think are interesting ideas for this kind of discussion, definitely. I think, yeah, in terms of a good drug policy, I think, you know, I mean, there are examples, and just to highlight one development that we have in terms of, you know, an important step forward in terms of drug policy debates at the international level. Although governments, you know, there isn't a consensus about how to move forward in terms of the future of drug policies, and there's a lot of fragmentation of how drug policies are moving forward, and I'll come on to that as well. But in terms of, you know, advocacy work that civil society has done for decades, in terms of at the UN level, one win in the last, just over the last 18 months has been to see that the UN system itself, so these are the UN entities led by the Secretary General, have come out with a UN common position on drugs. And that is a very important progressive position that I think we all need to take into consideration, that governments also need to be aware of. It's basically the advice, the guidance from the UN system based on all the evidence that they looked at, particularly over the last decade of drug control. And, you know, first and foremost amongst those has been, you know, a real strong, unequivocal call for the decriminalization of drug use and possession for personal use, seeing how much that has undermined people's health and well-being in terms of criminalizing people for using drugs, but also in support of policies like harm reduction, you know, ensuring that people who use drugs have access to basic services to reduce the harms of drug use and reduce risks like HIV infection if they're injecting, for example. So I think, you know, there's a lot of evidence out there in terms of what constitutes important policies that we need to put in place in certain environments. And just in terms of I hope it's okay, I'm sort of answering another question that's coming next also around, you know, how else can we leverage, you know, the way that illicit economies support people's livelihoods. You know, within the drug policy discussion, we're going one step further now, and also talking about, you know, as for example, the medical cannabis market opens up, and also non-adult use of cannabis markets in countries like Canada and Uruguay, and many more countries will follow. How do we ensure that traditional communities that grow cannabis can be meaningfully involved in those developments and benefit from those developments rather than just corporations? And I think, you know, we have to consider that, you know, a crop like coca, you know, there's a lot of traditional use of coca. The coca leaf itself has many other potential uses, you know, in its natural plant-based form. And the idea that coca farmers could you know, be involved in if we could open up more internationally the coca market, how you could bring coca growing communities into that market to actually benefit from that, with all of the challenges and complexities that we've talked about. But I think, you know, there are also market dynamics at play in the wider drug policy reform discussion that can also benefit some of the communities that we're talking about.
Thank you very much, Anna, and everyone else. I think we are slightly past our timing. So, Anna, you have answered the final question that we had from our audience, but I'll just repeat it in case any of our other speakers or panelists wanted to add anything and have some concluding remarks before we end today's session. So this question is coming basically from opium farmers from Myanmar through Tom Kramer. Some of us are calling for the legalization of opium cultivation for traditional and medical purposes, like Anna, you're mentioning. What do panelists think about this as an option? So if any of our panelists or speakers from the project team would like to have any additional points or any final concluding remarks before we end the session.
Yes, I think, sorry again, I think it's related to Myanmar, so I think, yes, I think ideally, I think it's, the proposal seems to solve to stop the, you know, criminalization of the opium farmer. But practically, I think that may not, because I think we need to understand the nature of stake in Myanmar, I think, which is not pro-poor, which is not pro-minority. I think in that case, I think if legalization actually happen for poppy cultivation, then I think you find a new form of, you know, capitalism, local capitalism will grow up, and then that will create, you know, these farmers losing lands and so on and so forth. I think, therefore, I think I for myself do not think that that's the only and that's the most pragmatic solution for protecting, you know, the opium farmers.
Yeah, if I can just weigh in as well, just very quickly on the point of legalization. I mean, there's kind of a running joke, I guess, when you're talking about the Afghanistan context, that if drugs were legalized globally, then the Afghan economy would collapse overnight because so many livelihoods are dependent on the opium economy, right? So, so in the short term, I mean, I don't know if that's you know, a practical solution. However, you know, I think it's maybe more helpful to think about drug policy in terms of trade-offs. So we have a lot of evidence, particularly about what doesn't work in Afghanistan. And what doesn't work in Afghanistan is these overly securitized approaches to forced eradication. That's been proven time and time again to be quite ineffective. That's the approach that has been used in Afghanistan quite a lot, particularly in the early 2000s. Mid 2000s, and you know, it just hasn't been effective. And so, you know, we need a different approach going forward in Afghanistan and in many of the other countries. It seems to be that the evidence shows very similar dynamics. And so, one thing I think that is needed when we're talking about medical approaches, for example, is you know, effective programs for harm reduction. So that is something that there are a few NGOs that are trying to implement these programs in Afghanistan with varying success. And so our project, unfortunately, we haven't had a chance to look very deeply into this yet, but that is something that we want to understand more about. What kind of harm reduction would be practical, would be implementable in a context like Afghanistan, and what's working and what's not working. So this is perhaps, you know, maybe a little bit of preview in terms of what's to come on this project, but hopefully we'll have, you know, more evidence and more conclusions to present to you at a later date on that point. But so I'll leave it there.
Camilo and our panelists, did you want to have any final remarks?
Yes, if I just may come back on that one point, I think, you know, and that is, you know, Jasmine, you hit the nail on the head there, because that is actually where the conversation sits now in terms of drug policy reform and moves towards legal regulation. And it's really only relevant to the cannabis discussion at the moment in terms of what's actually happening. But our fight is a social justice fight. And it is about how we ensure that those people who have first of all, experienced the sharpest edges of the repressive policies, lived under criminality, now will stand to lose out as corporations move in and the trade becomes formally controlled by government. And that's really the challenge that's happening domestically within the United States also, but also it's a wider global debate that I think has also strong policy relevance for this development discussion as well.
Just to add, continue, go ahead.
Thank you, sorry. I just want to add two things. The MAF, right? MAF, the Monetary Fund, International
Monetary Fund.
Yes, said that just 1% of the money laundering in the world is intercepted, just 1%. So the drug money is dancing around the world. No? That's one thing. And the second thing that I want to say, that we have to invent a good drug policy. But I think we have to have clear three elements: right humans approach, reduce harm approach, and farmers' dignity or sovereignty approach, onset social justice approach. That's very important. We are facing right now in Colombia cannabis legalization, and of course not ethnic communities and no farmers are getting part of this new market. Just the same industries, the same huge industries. So we have to be clear in that. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Estefania, we are coming close to our time, to our ending time. Camilo, if you wanted to have like a one-sentence brief remarks, and then we are going to close it.
Just to conclude, I think that the importance of this kind of projects is that it helps us to have the conversation at the global level, but at the same time to bring this conversation to our societies, Colombia, Myanmar, and Afghanistan. And I think that this is important. It's a remarkable objective of this project. Is try to build these two conversations. Thank you.
Perfect. I think we couldn't conclude in much better than all your remarks, particularly the last ones. So time is up. Thank you, presenters and speakers. Thank you, everyone who joined us virtually. We invite you to go and download Voices from Borderlands. There is also a digital long-form version, and the translation into local languages hopefully is coming very soon. You can also subscribe to Drugs and Disorder newsletter via our website and get more information about the project's its methodology and its ethics and all processes and the team members and partners about it. And you can also join the conversation further with us on Twitter at drugs_disorder is our handle on Twitter. And in terms of those whose questions we couldn't ask due to the time limitations, apologies. I hope that once the recording of this event is out, we can continue the conversation through virtual world. Thank you again very much. It has been a pleasure having you all, and hopefully see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.